Tunisia, 1943. The sun is merciless. Heat waves ripple over the cracked ochre earth. A convoy of German Kübelwagens grinds forward, engines coughing dust into the desert air. Their thin tires slip over loose gravel as drivers curse under their breath, goggles streaked with sweat and grit. Then, a blur of motion. Two American Jeeps crest the ridge, their silhouettes small, boxy, almost unremarkable, yet unstoppable. They dart through wadis and rock-strewn paths where heavier vehicles bog down. Soldiers cling to their sides, helmets glinting in the light, radios crackling with confidence. Within seconds, they vanish again, a puff of dust, a distant hum. A German mechanic watches, jaw clenched. He knows his machine. Precise, engineered, immaculate, but fragile. Those American trucks, they move like desert foxes. No hesitation, no stalling. Later that evening, around a fire, one soldier mutters in disbelief, "It shouldn't be that fast. It's just a small car." But across the front lines, every German unit is saying the same thing. The American strange little vehicle can go anywhere, do anything, and never seems to die. The war had found its most unlikely weapon. It began quietly, long before the thunder of tanks and the roar of bombers. In the late 1930s, while Europe trembled on the brink of war, the U.S. Army faced a peculiar problem. It had no true light reconnaissance vehicle. Its motor pool consisted of motorcycles, outdated trucks, and a handful of civilian cars modified for field duty. None could handle mud, snow, or steep terrain. Commanders needed something small, fast, and reliable, a machine that could scout, deliver messages, haul a gun, or carry the wounded. In July 1940, as Hitler's panzers swept through France, the U.S. Army issued an urgent request to American automakers. The requirements were almost impossible. A four-wheel drive vehicle, weighing less than 1,300 pounds, able to carry 3 soldiers and climb a 40% grade, and the prototype had to be delivered in just 49 days. Only one small company dared to accept, the American Bantam Car Company, a struggling Pennsylvania firm led by engineer Carl Probst. Working day and night, Probst and his team built the first prototype, the Bantam Reconnaissance Car, or BRC, and delivered it to the Army on time. It was crude, but revolutionary, light, agile, and unstoppable. Army test officers were stunned. For the first time, a vehicle could go where horses and motorcycles failed. It climbed embankments, forded rivers, and crossed terrain that would break heavier trucks. Bantam had given the U.S. military exactly what they asked for, but there was a catch. The company was too small to mass-produce it. The Army turned to larger automakers. Willys Overland and Ford Motor Company were brought in, given access to Bantam's blueprints, and ordered to refine the design. Willys introduced its Go Devil engine, a powerful 60-horsepower motor that transformed the little car into a beast of mobility. Ford contributed improved standardization and production methods. By 1941, both were producing the final version, the Willys MB and the Ford GPW. They called it simply the Jeep. A slang term, likely derived from GP, or General Purpose Vehicle. Soldiers quickly gave it a soul. The Jeep became more than steel and rubber. It was a companion. As the United States entered World War II, Jeep production exploded. Assembly lines ran day and night. Detroit's factories, once making sedans and coupes, now turned out thousands of these stubby four-wheel drive machines, each one identical to the last, because in war, interchangeability meant survival. By late 1942, the Jeep was everywhere. From the sands of North Africa to the jungles of the Pacific, it became the universal soldier's chariot. Its genius lay not in complexity, but in simplicity. Flat fenders that served as seats, a windshield that folded flat for transport, and an engine that could be repaired with a wrench and wire. The British admired it. The Soviets demanded it through Lend-Lease. Even the Axis intelligence noted it with a mix of frustration and awe. The Jeep was not luxurious, not beautiful, but it embodied American engineering philosophy. Make it work, make it fast, make it cheap. While German officers boasted of precision machinery and custom designs, the Americans had created something far more dangerous, a weapon of mobility that could be built by the hundreds of thousands. As one Army general later put it, the Jeep did everything. It was our horse, our pack mule, and sometimes our coffin, but it always kept moving. By 1943, over 300,000 Jeeps were in service. The Allies had discovered that wars are not only won by firepower, but how fast you can move it. And somewhere across the Mediterranean, German mechanics began to wonder if their own vehicles could match this mechanical miracle.
Across the battlefield from the Jeep's arrival, another machine had already carved its place in the Wehrmacht's image of mobility, the Kübelwagen. Designed years earlier under the eye of Ferdinand Porsche, the Kübelwagen, or bucket car, was born from the same project that produced the Volkswagen Beetle, Adolf Hitler's dream of a people's car. In the late 1930s, Hitler had envisioned motorizing Germany, replacing horse-drawn carts with a national vehicle affordable to every citizen. Porsche engineered the prototype, and the Volkswagen factory in Wolfsburg was built to mass-produce it. But when war erupted in 1939, that dream shifted. The factory no longer produced family cars, it made vehicles for war. The basic Beetle platform was modified into the Type 82 Kübelwagen, a light military car that mirrored German engineering values, efficiency, precision, and durability. The Kübelwagen was rear-engined, air-cooled, and lightweight. It lacked the Jeep's four-wheel drive, but made up for it with a remarkably efficient transmission and torsion bar suspension. It could travel long distances on little fuel, a critical advantage in the early Blitzkrieg campaigns across Europe and North Africa. German officers praised it for reliability on paved and semi-firm ground. In 1940 and 1941, when Germany's armies seemed unstoppable, the Kübelwagen served faithfully. From the French countryside to the Russian steppes, it carried officers, maps, and radios. Its simplicity and Volkswagen heritage made it easy to mass-produce. Over 50,000 units were built by mid-war. But its design philosophy revealed a deeper difference between German and American thinking. The German approach favored engineering perfection, a design to perform precisely within its limits on roads under command discipline with expert maintenance. The American philosophy was the opposite. Rugged improvisation, build it cheap, make it fixable, let soldiers figure the rest out. The Kübelwagen worked best on hard ground. It was light enough to float on sand, but without four-wheel drive, it often bogged down on steep or muddy terrain. In the early stages of war, that didn't matter. The Wehrmacht's victories came on roads and plains. But as the war dragged on, Germany faced harsher terrains. The deserts of North Africa, the forests of Italy, the frozen mud of the Eastern Front. Here, precision gave way to reality. Reports began to surface. The Kübelwagen couldn't keep pace with heavier convoys in deep mud or mountain trails. Mechanics struggled to repair it without parts, and unlike the Jeep, its components weren't interchangeable with other vehicles. Meanwhile, American GIs could replace a Jeep transmission in the field with basic tools. Spare parts were everywhere, thanks to standardized production. The U.S. military's logistical network, powered by Ford, Willys, and hundreds of subcontractors, ensured that no Jeep stayed dead for long. German engineers took notice. Captured Jeeps were tested extensively. In 1942, at testing grounds in Kummersdorf, Wehrmacht officers dissected an American Willys. They admired its simplicity and ruggedness, things alien to German automotive tradition. Reports described it as primitive yet ingenious. In 1943, Porsche introduced a new variant, the Schwimmwagen, an amphibious light vehicle based on the Kübelwagen. It added four-wheel drive and could even float, impressive in design, but complicated to build and maintain. It was a triumph of creativity, but not of practicality. Production was slow, costs high, and availability limited. The contrast was clear. America's Jeep was a tool of mass production. Germany's Kübelwagen and Schwimmwagen were products of craftsmanship. One served an empire of factories, the other served an army of precision. And in a total war, it was quantity and reliability, not artistry, that would decide victory. As Allied troops rolled across deserts and jungles in their thousands of jeeps, German commanders began facing an uncomfortable truth. Their own machines, beautiful on paper, were being outperformed by a simple, square American vehicle that seemed impossible to stop. The mechanical duel between the Kübelwagen and the Jeep had only just begun.
For the men who fought the war, machines weren't just tools, they were lifelines. To the Americans, the Jeep became something deeply personal. It was not simply a vehicle, it was a companion that seemed to understand them. Soldiers gave their Jeeps names, painted teeth and pinups on the hoods, and took pride in keeping them running through impossible terrain. The sound of its Go Devil engine, a low, steady growl, meant safety, mobility, and connection. Private William Sloan, serving in North Africa, once wrote in his journal, "If the Jeep could talk, it would probably complain, but it never quits, not in the sand, not in the rain, not under fire." For German troops, the Kübelwagen was familiar, respectable, and efficient, but impersonal. It was an officer's car, cleanly designed and strictly maintained. The difference mirrored the two armies themselves. The Americans valued initiative and adaptability. The Germans prized precision and hierarchy. In the harsh desert, those differences became visible in the dust. While Kübelwagens moved neatly in convoy lines, Jeeps bounced across dunes, cutting their own paths. The American way was messy, fast, and flexible. The vehicle matched the mindset. Commanders could reach the front lines within minutes. Wounded men could be hauled back just as quickly. When fuel ran low, soldiers siphoned from tanks or aircraft. The Jeep allowed improvisation. It rewarded daring. German mechanics watched this with frustration. The Kübelwagen, though efficient on firm ground, could lose momentum in deep sand. Its rear-wheel drive demanded careful handling. The moment it stopped, it often sank. Crews learned to carry boards or ropes to help pull themselves out. The Jeep, by contrast, simply gunned its way through, bouncing forward in defiance of logic. Even off the battlefield, the human bond to the Jeep deepened. Soldiers slept in them, cooked on their hoods, and sometimes even buried them when the war ended, as if parting with a friend. The vehicle's simplicity gave it a soul. It could be patched with wire, wood, or tin cans, and still roll on. That rugged character reflected the American industrial spirit. Factories had produced a machine meant not for engineers, but for ordinary men, men with grease on their hands and dirt under their boots. On the tactical level, the Jeep changed everything about how an army could move. Before its arrival, light reconnaissance depended on motorcycles or horse patrols, both vulnerable and limited. The Jeep could scout far ahead, radio back enemy positions, and disappear before a shot was fired. It was small enough to hide, fast enough to escape, and strong enough to carry gear or weapons. Soon, soldiers began modifying their Jeeps for specific missions. Some added machine guns or recoilless rifles. Others stripped off windshields to reduce glare.
The SAS in North Africa turned them into desert raiders, bristling with extra fuel cans and twin Vickers guns. They drove hundreds of miles behind enemy lines, striking airfields and supply dumps, always trusting their jeeps to bring them home. In one operation, an SAS patrol covered nearly 1,800 miles of desert, surviving on minimal water and rations, with only jeeps between them and death. The Kübelwagen could never have endured such punishment, not because it was poorly built, but because it was never meant to. The tactical difference was philosophical. The Kübelwagen was a product of control, designed to fit within an organized machine of war. The Jeep was a product of freedom, designed to let war fighters adapt and improvise. That freedom translated into speed, and speed into victory. Wherever American divisions went, the Jeep went first. It reconnoitered bridges before tanks arrived, carried generals to inspect front lines, and brought ammunition under fire. Its presence turned chaos into coordination. An army in motion needed a vehicle in motion. Even German officers began to notice the pattern. Intercepted reports mention American small trucks moving as if unbound by terrain. To them, it was not just a car. It was a tactical instrument, a swarm of mobile messengers that made the Allied advance unpredictable and fluid. For the men who depended on it, the Jeep became something to trust, more than orders, more than maps. It was the constant in a shifting world. And that trust, born from simplicity, began shaping not only battlefield morale, but the very rhythm of Allied warfare.
Technology tells the truth that propaganda cannot hide. When engineers on both sides examined the Jeep and Kübelwagen side by side, they weren't comparing beauty, they were comparing philosophies. The German Kübelwagen, the Volkswagen Type 82, embodied order. Its air-cooled flat-four engine, placed in the rear, meant it didn't need a radiator. That made it resilient in cold climates and resistant to freezing. It was lightweight, with a clever limited-slip differential and torsion bar suspension. On paper, it was brilliant, efficient, economical, and refined. The Jeep, by contrast, looked crude. Its leaf spring suspension was simple. Its square body was designed for stamping, not elegance. But what the Jeep lacked in finesse, it gained in versatility. Its four-wheel drive system could claw up slopes that stalled German cars. Its Go Devil engine, built by Willys, produced a modest 60 horsepower, but more importantly, it delivered torque where it mattered. It was built for dirt, not design. In German tests at Kummersdorf, mechanics observed the Jeep's drivetrain and were startled by its simplicity. Every component was overbuilt yet easy to replace. One officer noted, "Their design accepts imperfection, ours forbids it." That line captured the essence of the contrast. German vehicles were crafted to work perfectly within defined parameters. American vehicles were designed to survive despite their parameters. One was an engineer's pride, the other was a soldier's tool. From a leadership standpoint, the Jeep became more than equipment. It became a symbol of command presence. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces, later called the Jeep one of the 3 decisive tools that won World War II, alongside the C-47 transport aircraft and the Duck amphibious truck. He understood what it represented: mobility. In North Africa and Europe, generals and privates alike rode in the same kind of vehicle. It erased hierarchy in motion. The same Jeep that carried Patton to the front carried medics to the wounded. That universality created unity. Eisenhower's words echoed through post-war history. The Jeep, the Dakota, and the landing craft were the 3 tools that won the war. He meant it literally. Without the Jeep, command and control would have been slower, communications fragmented, and logistics strained. It gave commanders eyes and wheels in every theater. For the German high command, that was unnerving. Reports from 1943 onwards noted how American units could shift positions with alarming speed. The reason was not strategy alone, it was the mobility infrastructure built around vehicles like the Jeep. Where German divisions often relied on horse-drawn wagons for supplies, the U.S. Army used fleets of motorized transport. The Jeep sat at the front of that revolution. It didn't just carry people, it carried momentum. Technologically, the contrast deepened when field conditions degraded. Mud, snow, and heat tested every machine. The Kübelwagen's smooth undercarriage and high clearance gave it advantages on firm sand and frozen roads. But when mud thickened or terrain broke into ruts, its lack of four-wheel drive became a fatal flaw. Crews could only accelerate gently and pray the rear tires caught traction. The Jeep, meanwhile, welcomed rough ground. Its low gearing and compact wheelbase let it crawl up inclines the Kübelwagen dared not attempt. Allied troops discovered they could even use it to tow light artillery, carry stretchers, or mount anti-aircraft guns. Its frame, though light, was nearly indestructible. German attempts to close that technological gap led to experiments like the Type 87 four-wheel drive Beetle and Type 166 Schwimmwagen, vehicles that introduced four-wheel drive and amphibious capability. These were technical marvels, but logistical nightmares. The Schwimmwagen, though ingenious, required complex parts and specialized maintenance, luxuries the Wehrmacht could no longer afford as Allied bombing crippled its factories. By 1944, the Jeep had become a battlefield constant, the mechanical heartbeat of Allied mobility. German prisoners often remarked with envy at how many Jeeps the Americans possessed. One Luftwaffe officer reportedly said, "They build these things faster than we can destroy them." It wasn't an exaggeration. American industry could produce a Jeep every 2 minutes. By contrast, Germany was struggling to keep up with spare parts for its increasingly diverse fleet of vehicles. Tanks, trucks, motorcycles, half-tracks, and staff cars, each with their own unique components. This chaos contrasted sharply with America's doctrine of standardization. The U.S. Army could cannibalize parts between different Jeeps without issue. Everything fit, everything worked. The Germans admired that efficiency, but couldn't replicate it. Their production lines were too fragmented, their materials too scarce, and their engineering culture too rigid to adopt simplification as a virtue. In the end, even enemy engineers respected the Jeep's design purity. After the war, captured reports from the Wehrmacht described it as technically unsophisticated but operationally perfect. It wasn't fast, it wasn't elegant, but it was always there. The Jeep proved that the true power of technology lay not in perfection, but in adaptability. It was the difference between a war fought with precision and a war fought with persistence. And by 1943, persistence was winning. The stage was set for the decisive moment, when these philosophies would clash not just in design labs or field tests, but in the chaos of war itself.
Tunisia, spring 1943. The Desert War was ending. The last German and Italian divisions clung to the crumbling edges of North Africa, surrounded by British armor and American infantry. Among the thunder of tanks and artillery, a smaller, steadier sound filled the air, the hum of thousands of jeeps. They scouted ahead of armored columns, carrying lieutenants with binoculars and radios. They bounced through wadis and scrub, marking enemy positions. When tanks stalled, they ferried messages through smoke and shell fire. When the front shifted, they were already moving, dust trails sketching the outlines of Allied advance. German observers were astonished. Everywhere they looked, these little American machines appeared, crossing ground that Kübelwagens dared not. Their four-wheel drive bit into loose sand, climbed embankments, and charged through gullies. The Kübelwagen, in comparison, was left behind, a vehicle built for roads in a war that no longer had any. By early 1943, Allied mobility had become a weapon in itself. While the German Africa Corps struggled with overstretched supply lines and breakdowns, the Americans and British used jeeps to bridge every gap. They carried spare fuel, ammunition, and even spare parts for tanks. What horses had been for Napoleon, the jeep was for Eisenhower, an extension of willpower over distance. As the Allies pushed northward into Sicily and Italy, the contrast deepened. The European landscape was a punishing test of endurance. Mountain passes, cratered roads, mud that swallowed boots and wheels alike. Yet the jeep adapted effortlessly. Soldiers joked that, if the jeep couldn't make it, neither could we. In the mountains of Salerno, jeeps carried supplies up slopes where even mules slipped. They hauled wounded men down narrow trails, engines sputtering under the weight, but they kept moving. Mechanics ran field workshops out of tents, patching cracked axles and blown tires. The Willys Go Devil engine, with its cast iron block and simple carburetor, could be rebuilt with hand tools in the mud. Meanwhile, German forces deployed Kübelwagens and Schwimmwagens in similar terrain, but the difference was glaring. In Italy's rain-soaked hills, the Kübelwagen's light frame and rear-wheel drive struggled to find traction. Troops sometimes resorted to pushing or towing them uphill. The Schwimmwagen's amphibious propeller was ingenious, but useless where most battles were fought, in mountain passes and villages where mud replaced water. The Germans tried to adapt. Some field units improvised, mounting snow chains, modifying gear ratios, even swapping tires for thicker treads. Yet every attempt revealed the same flaw. The vehicle's design wasn't meant for universal combat. It had been built for the early blitzkrieg, when war was fast, linear, and paved with victory. By 1943, war had changed. It was no longer about straight lines and open roads. It was about endurance, improvisation, and logistics. And that's where the Jeep thrived. Captured German intelligence reports during this period read like reluctant admiration. One document recovered from a command post near Palermo described the Jeep as mechanically crude but tactically superior. Another compared it to the mule, stubborn, low, and everywhere. Even in propaganda, the Axis could not ignore its ubiquity. German soldiers began referring to them with a mix of awe and irritation, die kleinen Teufelwagen, the little devil cars. By contrast, Allied soldiers viewed the Kübelwagen almost with affection, as a curiosity when captured. It was smooth on the road, light to steer, and clever in design. But when pitted against the Jeep in rough terrain, it simply couldn't keep up. Field tests conducted after North Africa told the same story. British engineers compared both vehicles in desert conditions. Their conclusion was blunt. The American Jeep is capable of navigating terrain inaccessible to any comparable access vehicle. It wasn't about raw speed, it was about reliability. The Jeep could be battered, overworked, half-broken, and still roll forward. Kübelwagens were easier to handle but unforgiving under strain. This reliability gave the Allies something priceless: momentum. In modern warfare, momentum is survival. When an army can move faster than its enemy can respond, it dictates the battle's rhythm. The Jeep, by virtue of its mechanical endurance, became the pulse of that rhythm. By late 1943, German units in Italy began experimenting with captured Jeeps. Some officers ordered them repainted with Balkenkreuz markings and integrated into reconnaissance units. It was a quiet acknowledgement that the enemy's design was, in many respects, superior. But imitation couldn't overcome logistics. Germany lacked the mass production infrastructure to copy the Jeep at scale. Their factories were already under siege, bombed by Allied air raids,
starved of materials and choked by bureaucracy. While America built 600,000 Jeeps, Germany built less than 60,000 Kübelwagens and a fraction as many Schwimmwagens. The numbers told the truth no engineer could deny. Precision couldn't defeat production. The war's mobile heart had shifted, and its beat was American. The next year would make that dominance impossible to ignore, when thousands of Jeeps rolled onto the beaches of Normandy, defining the modern age of mechanized warfare. June 6, 1944. Normandy, France. Before dawn, the invasion fleet loomed across the Channel, 5,000 ships carrying the fate of Europe. And hidden among the steel and soldiers were thousands of Jeeps, lashed to decks, wrapped in tarps, and ready to roll. They weren't glamorous, no armor, no guns, just compact, four-wheeled workhorses painted olive drab. Yet when the ramps dropped and chaos met the shore, they became the veins of the invasion. Jeeps splashed through shallow water behind the first assault waves. Their engines coughed, sputtered, and then caught. Drivers jammed gears, climbing over debris, weaving between shell holes and wreckage. They carried medics, radio operators, officers, anyone who needed to move faster than boots could carry them. By nightfall, as men dug into the hedgerows of Normandy, the Jeep was already doing what it always did, linking the front with the rear. While tanks bogged down in the marshy terrain and trucks sunk axle-deep in mud, Jeeps found narrow paths, cart tracks, farm lanes, even ditches, and kept supply lines alive. General Eisenhower later said plainly, "The Jeep, the Dakota, and the landing craft were the three tools that won the war." Across the front, German soldiers watched in disbelief. The Kübelwagen, designed for speed across the open plains of France and Poland, was helpless in the close, muddy chaos of Normandy's bocage. Its light frame and rear-wheel drive made it easy to handle, but impossible to recover once stuck. Meanwhile, the American Jeep leapt hedgerows like a mountain goat. Engineers improvised hedgerow cutters, welded steel prongs that let Jeeps ram through thickets that trapped tanks. In reconnaissance patrols, the Jeep's silence and speed gave it an almost predatory edge. They slipped through fog and farm roads, ambushing convoys or calling artillery from radios mounted on the dash. Captured reports from German units described these raids with growing frustration. The Americans employ small motor vehicles in every terrain and at every hour. Their movement cannot be predicted. To a Wehrmacht built on rigid formations and defined fronts, this was chaos, a kind of warfare they couldn't control. By August 1944, the breakout from Normandy turned chaos into momentum. Patton's Third Army surged eastward, covering nearly 600 miles in 30 days, a feat unthinkable without the Jeep. Staff cars couldn't handle the terrain. Half-tracks were too heavy, but the Jeep could slip between everything: rivers, rubble, forests. Each division's command post was a swarm of them, Jeeps ferrying orders, ammunition, even field rations. They became command centers on wheels, and when radios failed, dispatchers raced messages across entire sectors. In one operation, Patton's supply offices converted Jeeps into makeshift fuel carriers, strapping jerry cans to their sides and rear. When gasoline ran short, it was the Jeep, not the tank, that found a way to bring more. Further north, in the Netherlands, Jeeps were again the spearhead. During Operation Martingarten, paratroopers relied on them to move swiftly across captured bridges and villages. British airborne troops nicknamed them godsend cars, small enough to be dropped by glider, yet strong enough to haul artillery. When the operation faltered and bridges fell under German fire, Jeeps became ambulances under shelling, evacuating the wounded faster than any other vehicle. Soldiers later recalled how their drivers seemed fearless, guiding headlights through darkness, bullets skipping off metal hoods as engines roared through the night. For the Germans, the difference was infuriating. Their Schwimmwagens, while technically amphibious, couldn't handle the same punishment. They floated across rivers but broke down after long marches. In field conditions, their engines overheated, their suspension cracked, and their spare parts were impossible to find. The Jeep, by contrast, could be fixed with the wrench and scrap wire. Soldiers joked that a Jeep could be rebuilt from parts of another, and it often was. By the winter of 1944, the Germans were in retreat, but they still had one desperate counteroffensive left, the Battle of the Bulge. In the freezing Ardennes, temperatures dropped below -20 degrees Celsius. Fuel froze, engines seized, and even horses died in their tracks. Yet Jeeps, covered in frost, engines idling through the night, kept the lines connected. They carried ammunition through forests where tanks couldn't move, evacuated wounded under artillery fire, and even mounted .50 caliber machine guns for last-ditch defense. Some were painted white for camouflage, others wrapped in blankets to muffle the noise. When the fog lifted and Allied forces struck back, Jeeps led the counterattack, pushing through snow-covered roads littered with wreckage. Captured German accounts again mention them. The American small car appears even in snowstorms. It seems impossible to stop. It was no longer admiration, it was resignation. By 1945, as Allied columns crossed the Rhine and pushed into Germany, the Jeep had become a symbol of inevitability. Every village saw them first, dusty, mud-cucked, headlights dimmed. Behind them came trucks, armor, and artillery, but the Jeep always arrived ahead of victory. Even German civilians took notice. Children called them die kleinen Amerikanerwagen, the little American cars. They knew what their arrival meant. The war was ending. When Berlin fell, Jeeps rolled through the ruins beside Sherman tanks. They carried generals to surrender sites, journalists to the front lines, and photographers to history itself. One photograph, an U.S. soldier in a Jeep parked beneath the shattered Brandenburg Gate, came to symbolize more than victory. It captured the essence of American industrial genius, a war machine that wasn't monstrous, but practical, not elegant, but unstoppable. The Kübelwagen and Schwimmwagen, though technically amphibious, couldn't handle the same punishment. They floated across rivers but broke down after long marches. In field conditions, their engines overheated, their suspension cracked, and their spare parts were impossible to find. The Jeep, by contrast, could be fixed with the wrench and scrap wire. Soldiers joked that a Jeep could be rebuilt from parts of another, and it often was. The Kübelwagen and Schwimmwagen, though clever, represented an old philosophy: precision without adaptability. The Jeep embodied something new: mass simplicity as strategic power. It wasn't the fastest, strongest, or prettiest machine of the war, but it was the one that never stopped moving. And that, in the end, is how the United States won the race for global mobility, and with it, the modern age.
May 1945, Germany. The guns had fallen silent. Smoke hung above shattered cities, drifting between ruins where once stood factories, rail stations, and entire armies. In the quiet that followed, the victors surveyed not just the cost of war, but the machinery that had carried them there. Rows of Jeeps rolled through the rubble-strewn streets of Berlin, Paris, and Warsaw. Some still bore battle scars, bullet dents, cracked windshields, torn canvas roofs. Mechanics patched them with tape, rope, and hope. And yet, they kept running. German officers who once dismissed them as crude or unrefined now studied them like relics of a new religion. Engineers at Wolfsburg and Stuttgart, men who had designed the Kübelwagen and Schwimmwagen, quietly admitted that the Jeep had done what their vehicles never could: survive every environment, every climate, every front. One Wehrmacht report written after the war put it plainly: the American light vehicle was built without elegance, but with genius. It was the weapon of mobility. That line, weapon of mobility, would echo through decades of military design philosophy. In the months following surrender, Allied occupation forces relied more heavily on the Jeep than ever before. It became the lifeline of a continent in ruins, delivering supplies, carrying mail, moving engineers, doctors, and officers across lands where bridges were gone and roads barely existed. From the fjords of Norway to the mountains of Austria, the same small silhouette appeared everywhere, rattling across cobblestones, splashing through streams, ferrying food and medicine to civilians. For many Europeans, the Jeep became their first image of post-war America. It wasn't the bomber or the tank that symbolized liberation. It was this small, dust-covered vehicle driven by a soldier handing out chocolate to children. In Italy and France, abandoned Jeeps were repaired and converted into everything from taxis to farm trucks. Local workshops stripped military markings, welded cargo beds, and gave them new lives in peacetime economies. The simplicity that made the Jeep unstoppable in war made it invaluable in rebuilding peace. Meanwhile, the U.S. Army recognized that the Jeep had rewritten the logistics of warfare. Reports from the Army Service Forces concluded that mobility, not armor, had determined success across campaigns. The Jeep's light frame allowed for fast deployments, decentralized command, and improvisation at every level. Officers no longer needed to wait for armored convoys. Scouts could traverse entire battle zones without support, and medical units could evacuate wounded soldiers from front lines that tanks couldn't reach. It wasn't just a vehicle, it was an operational revolution. When planners began shaping the early outlines of post-war defense, one thing was clear: every army of the future would need its own Jeep. Across the Atlantic, the German engineers who had once built the Kübelwagen faced a humbling truth. The Volkswagen plant at Wolfsburg, bombed, stripped, and nearly abandoned, was revived under British supervision. Major Ivan Hurst, an officer in the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers, walked through the shattered factory floors and saw piles of Kübelwagen parts and half-finished cars. He gave a simple order: restart production not for the Wehrmacht, but for civilians. From those ruins emerged the Volkswagen Beetle, a spiritual descendant of the Kübelwagen, reborn for peace. Ironically, its survival owed much to lessons learned from the Jeep: durability, simplicity, and universal appeal. Meanwhile, in the United States, Willys Overland quickly pivoted from war to peace. Their new model, the CJ2A, stood for Civilian Jeep. It was marketed as the farmer's helper, the construction worker's friend, and the explorer's tool. The same machine that once conquered the deserts of Tunisia and the forests of Europe now plowed fields and hauled hay. It became a peacetime icon, proof that military innovation could translate directly into civilian life. But even as Reconstruction began, one truth lingered in every strategist's mind: the next war, if it came, would be defined not by massed divisions, but by mobility. The Jeep had proved that movement, the ability to appear, strike, and vanish, was the ultimate advantage. That lesson wasn't lost on anyone, not the Americans, not the British, and certainly not the Soviets. By 1946, the Red Army began designing its own copy, the Gaz 67B, a rugged, boxy off-roader unmistakably inspired by the Jeep. Chinese engineers followed a decade later. Even in Germany, post-war military projects quietly studied its chassis, transmission, and wheelbase. The Jeep had transcended nationality.
It had become a template for modern warfare, a universal design for a new, fast-moving world. And yet, beneath all the technical reports and engineering analyses, something deeper was happening. The Jeep had changed how soldiers saw war itself. It had made command personal, logistics human, and movement intimate. You could see the man behind the wheel. You could ride beside him. It made warfare smaller, more connected, and paradoxically, more humane. In a world scarred by total destruction, that mattered.
1946 to 1950. Peace returned, but the Jeep didn't retire. From the ruins of Europe to the jungles of Asia, its familiar outline became the flag-bearer of a new world order. When American forces redeployed to occupy Japan, Jeeps led the convoys again, this time not as conquerors, but as guardians. They climbed the same mountain roads once used by Japanese artillery, now carrying food, medical aid, and reconstruction materials. The same engine that had once chased Axis convoys now pulled plows and trailers for rice farmers. To the Japanese, it was astonishing. The machine that had once symbolized defeat had become the instrument of recovery. Mechanics studied its parts, reverse-engineered its simplicity, and took notes. A decade later, those lessons helped shape a new generation of Japanese off-roaders, Toyota's Land Cruiser and Nissan's Patrol, both directly influenced by the Jeep's wartime design. The American Jeep had quietly sparked a global design revolution. Across the Atlantic, the British took their own lessons to heart. In 1948, Rover engineers unveiled the Land Rover Series 1, an unmistakable echo of the Jeep, adapted for empire, exploration, and farm work. Its boxy aluminum body, exposed hinges, and utilitarian lines were deliberate tributes to the American design. The Land Rover would go on to become Britain's equivalent of the Jeep, serving in colonies, deserts, and mountain passes across the Commonwealth. And while rivals emerged, the Gas 69, the French De La Haye, the Italian Campagnola, none could match the sheer symbolic weight of the original Willys. For by then, the Jeep had become something larger than a machine. It was an identity, the visual shorthand of American reach and resilience. In the early years of the Cold War, that image mattered more than ever. As the Iron Curtain descended, American forces once again found themselves stationed in divided Europe. Jeeps patrolled Berlin's rubble-strewn streets, rolled through bases in West Germany, and appeared in propaganda photographs as the embodiment of Allied strength, small, practical, and unshakably confident. In newsreels, the Jeep became the quiet constant in a changing world. You saw it at NATO exercises, Korean hillsides, and embassy compounds. It symbolized not just military might, but mobility as freedom, the power to move, to respond, to act anywhere on Earth. Even the Soviet Union understood the message. Their engineers, while publicly dismissing Western technology, continued to refine Jeep-inspired designs, the Gaz 69, the UAZ 469, all borrowing its proportions and philosophy. Mobility had become the great equalizer in geopolitics, and it all began with a boxy, unassuming 4x4 built for $739 a unit. But beyond strategy and symbolism, the Jeep had a cultural afterlife no engineer could have predicted. American soldiers returning home took their memories of the vehicle with them. On farms, in forests, and on construction sites, they replicated the feeling of command and independence they'd felt overseas. The GI Jeep became a pop culture icon. In films, toys, and comics, Hollywood cast it alongside heroes and explorers. Advertisers sold it as a tool for freedom and self-reliance. By the 1950s, the Jeep was no longer just a machine. It was a myth of motion, the embodiment of the American spirit. Simple, strong, and unstoppable. When the Korean War erupted in 1950, that myth was tested again. The new M38 Jeep, an evolution of the wartime Willys, returned to the battlefield. Once more, it climbed hills that trucks couldn't, crossed rivers under fire, and carried generals to the front. In Seoul, in Busan, in the frozen hills of the Chosin Reservoir, Jeeps did what they always had: move when nothing else could. A journalist writing for Stars and Stripes put it best: the Jeep doesn't just carry soldiers, it carries the war itself. By the time the 1960s arrived, the world was full of imitations, but none captured the original spirit. American forces in Vietnam rode newer models, the M151 Mutt, still spiritually a Jeep. Across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, surplus Jeeps became police vehicles, ambulances, even parade cars for newly independent nations. Wherever freedom took root, the Jeep appeared. Its presence said, "America has arrived." And quietly, engineers everywhere accepted a simple truth that the Germans had discovered back in 1943. No amount of precision could replace functional genius. The Kübelwagen had been smart. The Schwimmwagen had been clever. But the Jeep was right. It represented an engineering philosophy that would dominate the rest of the century: ruggedness over refinement, adaptability over perfection, simplicity over sophistication. That philosophy reshaped not only the military, but the entire civilian automobile industry. From SUVs to pickup trucks to global off-road design, every vehicle that could go anywhere owed something to that wartime legend. By the end of the Second World War, the Jeep had traveled farther than any tank, any general, any army. And long after the soldiers went home, it kept rolling into jungles, deserts, and highways of a rebuilding world. The Germans had tried to copy it. The world had tried to improve it. But nobody ever truly replaced it. Because the Jeep was never just a machine. It was America on wheels, and it never stopped moving. In every war, there are weapons that define power: tanks, bombers, submarines. But the Jeep was never about power. It was about presence, the quiet, relentless kind that wins wars not by destruction, but by endurance. It didn't roar through history with grandeur. It rolled through it, steady, purposeful, and unbreakable. From the deserts of North Africa to the forests of Europe and the islands of the Pacific, the Jeep carried soldiers, medics, and messages. It carried courage, fear, and exhaustion. It carried the war itself, piece by piece across impossible ground. When the shooting stopped, it carried something else: hope. It became the bridge between war and peace, between soldier and citizen. And in that transformation, it revealed something profound about the modern age: that true strength lies not in perfection, but in persistence. The Germans had mastered precision. Their vehicles were elegant, exact, and complex. The Americans built something crude, but it worked. Everywhere. Always. Under any condition. In that difference lay the essence of two worlds colliding: ideology versus practicality, precision versus purpose. The Jeep was more than steel and rubber. It was an idea that mobility equals freedom, that progress comes from motion, and that no obstacle is permanent if you keep moving forward. That idea would outlive the war, the factories, even the men who built it. It would shape Cold War strategy, civilian technology, and the global image of America for generations. In photographs from Normandy to Baghdad, from Berlin to Saigon, the Jeep appears unchanged: small, resilient, symbolic, always moving, always carrying something vital. And so, the story of the Jeep isn't really about a vehicle. It's about a way of thinking, a reminder that the greatest inventions in history are rarely beautiful, but always brave. It's about simplicity born of necessity, strength forged in purpose, and faith that even in the darkest hours, motion means survival. The Jeep never stopped for war or peace or time. It just kept going, because that's what freedom does.